Hi, my name is Anna Page, and I'm in a group with Kevin Childs for Social Work 630, and this is our presentation on the intergenerational effects of Indian residential schools, a historical trauma. This paper explores the intergenerational effects of the Indian residential schools, referred to as IRSs, which is a system in Canada where Aboriginal children were torn from their homes and essentially held hostage in boarding schools, where reports of neglect and abuse were common. The research from this paper asserts that, quote, intergenerational IRS trauma continues to undermine the well-being of today's Aboriginal population, and having a familial history of IRS attendance has also been linked with more frequent contemporary stressor experiences and relatively greater effects of stressors on well-being. It is also suggested that familial IRS attendance across several generations within a family appears to have cumulative effects. Together, these findings provide empirical support for the concept of historical trauma, which takes the perspective that the consequences of numerous and sustained attacks against a group may accumulate over generations and interact with proximal stressors to undermine collective well-being. This paper discusses the idea of Indian residential schools as a historical trauma. The historical trauma is the concept that the accumulation of collective stressors and trauma that began in the past may contribute to increased risk for negative health and social outcomes among contemporary peoples. The researchers in this paper define historical trauma if the event was widespread among a specific group or population, with many group members being affected. The event was perpetrated by an outgroup with purposeful and often destructive intent, and that if the event was generating high levels of collective distress in the victimized group. Indian residential schools have a distinct history of horrors. In 19th century Canada, numerous government policies were created with the beliefs that whites were superior to Indians, who were believed to be savage and uncivilized. IRSs were created in 1880 to address what was considered the Indian problem, where the government forcibly removed Aboriginal children from their families to reside in these boarding schools. These children often had little to no contact with their family or tribe. And by 1930, roughly 75% of all First Nation children between the ages of 7 and 15 were in schools. And over the history of the schools, 150,000 children attended them, and some were taken from their parents as young as 3. As I previously stated, children as young as 3 were forced by law to leave their families and communities, to live at schools designed to, quote, kill the Indian in the child. These schools taught Aboriginal children to be ashamed of their languages, cultural beliefs, traditions, and were largely ineffective at providing proper or even adequate education. Oftentimes, children were beaten and punished severely for displaying any sort of behavior that connected them back to their native history, such as language or dances or any sort of ceremonies that were considered to be Indian. Much of this abuse was overlooked or condoned by the government officials and school administrators involved. The rationale for choosing this cultural rather than physical genocide was considered economic. It was concluded that it would cost $1 million to kill an Indian in warfare, whereas it only cost $1,200 to school an Indian child in these IRSs for 8 years. Many studies show a long legacy of abuse. In 1989, it was found that 8 out of 10 girls under the age of 8 had been victims of sexual abuse while in the schools, and 50% of boys in the same age. There were many incidents recorded of runaway children being accidentally killed, injured. There are many reports of starvation, isolation, exposure to the elements, corporal punishment, and hundreds of children committed suicide. Over 4,000 children were reported to have died in the boarding schools, although the numbers are suspected to be much higher. In one boarding school in Canada, the skeletal remains of babies were found hidden in the wall when they tore the school down. In 1907, newspapers reported that medical inspections of schools found actually a 24% death rate among children in the school. and that 42% of all the children who attended that died after they were sent home when they became critically ill from diseases that they brought home with them from the schools. Of the hundreds of children that committed suicide, many of them committed suicide once they were returned home. And there were over 7,000 complaints of physical abuse that really went uninvestigated. The Supreme Court Justice in Canada, Douglas Hogarth, described the residential school system as, quote, nothing more than institutionalized pedophilia. The Prime Minister of Canada openly said after the schools were closed down that no apologies, no compensation, and no admission of government liability would be offered to the Aboriginal people. This article describes some of the intergenerational effects of the Indian residential boarding schools. The intergenerational effects associated with IRS attendance are undeniable. Studies have shown that the effects of trauma do not stop at the person directly impacted by the trauma. They recognize a ripple effect that begins and indirect family members who begin to show the same symptoms associated with trauma. Research conducted showed that 37% of adults that had at least one parent who attended an IRS thought about committed suicide, as opposed to the average of 25% of those who did not have parents that attended. These intergenerational effects played a substantial role in the lives of their children, grandchildren, and potentially the entire community. In addition to that, there are reported to be higher rates of learning difficulties and learning disabilities of the children and grandchildren of those who attended IRSs, not to mention higher rates of drug abuse, higher rates of hepatitis C contraction, and additionally, there's also higher reports of sexual victimization in the children and grandchildren of those who attended IRSs. Theories suggest that historical trauma increases a person's likelihood of depression, suicidal ideation, learning disabilities, and other issues. One reason that researchers believe that trauma is passed down through generations is that parents who suffer from trauma will ultimately and unknowingly expose their children to their own functional impairments. If the parents exhibit signs of depression due to their past trauma, the children then become more susceptible to those symptoms, which increases the likelihood of them displaying the same symptoms as those who were originally traumatized. This article recognized something called a cumulative effect, which was the idea that a historical trauma can be experienced by a person primarily, and then as the generations go on, the children and grandchildren experience cumulative and, if not sometimes more damaging effects as they grow up in households where there's dysfunction and abuse and drug abuse by the people who experienced the original trauma. One of the authors suggested that there's a biological expression of historical trauma, and that in light of emerging literature on epigenetics and the implications of this intergenerational pathway, stressful encounters may result in epigenetic changes. In this epigenetic change, expressions of certain genes might be suppressed or expressed, providing that they are present in germ cells. This indicates that abuse suffered can potentially manipulate genes, impacting future generations. Research suggests that not only people directly involved with the trauma are affected, but the trauma can affect future generations along with the entire community. This theory leads researchers to believe that genetics may play a role in the long-lasting effects of trauma. Additionally, Aboriginal people have suffered from intergenerational stress proliferation, where parental stress influences children's exposure to stressors indirectly through social disadvantages and directly by altering their parents' behaviors. Positive community interventions have been implemented to help people cope with these traumas. The researchers identified the ideas that through individual therapy and psychoeducation, families can learn how the effects of trauma have impacted their lives and therefore begin to make changes. IRSs have negatively impacted an entire community for over 100 years. The effects of the trauma have left a lasting imprint on Native people. However, the researchers believe with proper implementation of interventions and therapy that the chain can ultimately be broken. The use of historical trauma framework to explore and deconstruct genocide and other forms of massive organized violence to shed light on common mechanisms and distinct features, which may in turn help social work professionals to identify and trace this sort of looping effect from the political processes to the individual trauma experienced and the destructive cycle that can result. Recognizing and addressing a historical trauma is essential to promoting collective healing, resilience, and recovery for those who experience the trauma both directly and indirectly. So that is our presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to reviewing all of yours.